Are you ready for an irresistibly hot love story that will make you forget the world outside? Tonight, lie back in bed and let me whisper in your ear the most captivating tale of forbidden desire and burning passion you've ever heard. The Billionaire Falls for the maid from the countryside, a hot bedtime romance story. But first, subscribe now and let me be your nightly companion in romance. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The elevator climbed silently through glass tower, each floor bringing Elena Rodriguez closer to a world she'd only seen in magazines. Her callous hands gripped the handles of her worn suitcase as Manhattan stretched endlessly below, a glittering maze of ambition and steel. At 23, she'd never imagined leaving the rolling hills of Tennessee, but her family's mounting medical bills had forced her hand. 68th floor, the elevator announced in a crisp voice that made her small-town accent feel thick as molasses. Elena smoothed her simple blue dress, her Sunday best, and checked her reflection one last time. Dark waves framed her face, and her green eyes held a mixture of determination and terror. The agency had been clear. Mr. Alexander Sterling demanded perfection, discretion, and absolute professionalism. No personal relationships. No exceptions. The doors opened to reveal a reception area that screamed wealth. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park. A woman in an expensive suit glided toward her, her heels clicking with authority. "You must be Elena. I'm Ms. Chun, Mr. Sterling's personal assistant." Her smile was polite but distant. "He's in meetings all day, so I'll show you to your quarters and explain your duties." Elena nodded, suddenly feeling like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Ms. Chun led her through corridors lined with abstract art worth more than her family's farm. They passed a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library with books bound in leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows everywhere, making the penthouse feel suspended in the clouds. "Your room," Ms. Chun announced, opening a door to reveal a space larger than Elena's entire childhood bedroom. It was elegantly furnished with a queen bed, a sitting area, and its own marble bathroom. You'll have access to the staff areas, kitchen, and laundry room. Mr. Sterling's private quarters are off limits unless specifically requested for cleaning. Elena set down her suitcase, overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding her. "When will I meet Mr. Sterling?" "He prefers minimal interaction with household staff. You'll receive your daily assignments through me." Ms. Chen's tone suggested this arrangement wasn't negotiable. "He values privacy above all else. Start tomorrow at 6 a.m. sharp." After Ms. Chen left, Elena unpacked her modest belongings, feeling like a country mouse in a palace. She'd researched Alexander Sterling online, 35 years old, worth billions from his tech empire, and devastatingly handsome in a cold, untouchable way. The gossip sites called him the Ice King of Wall Street, known for his brilliant mind and complete lack of interest in relationships that lasted longer than a few weeks. Her first morning began before dawn. Elena moved to the penthouse like a ghost, polishing surfaces that already gleamed and arranging flowers that cost more than her monthly salary back home. The place felt like a museum, beautiful but sterile, lacking any warmth or personality. She was dusting the massive living room when she heard the front door open. Male voices drifted through the space, one deep and commanding, the other eager and obsequious. "The merger documents need to be perfect, Richards. I don't accept excuses, only results." The voice sent an unexpected shiver down Elena's spine, rich, authoritative, with an edge that suggested crossing him would be unwise. Elena quickly gathered her supplies, hoping to disappear before being noticed. But as she turned toward the service corridor, she collided with something solid and warm. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her as her cleaning supplies scattered across the marble floor. Elena looked up and found herself staring into the most intense gray eyes she'd ever seen. Alexander Sterling stood before her, close enough that she could catch his scent. Expensive cologne mixed with something distinctly masculine that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. He was taller than she'd expected, his perfectly tailored suit emphasizing broad shoulders and a lean, powerful build. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his fingers through it, and there was a shadow of stubble along his strong jaw that gave him a dangerous edge his photos had never captured. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," Elena stammered, very aware of his hand still gripping her shoulders, his touch burning through the thin fabric of her uniform. I didn't know you were. Who are you? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried absolute authority. His eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. Elena Rodriguez, sir. The new housekeeper. She tried to step back, but his hands tightened almost imperceptibly, keeping her in place. You're not what I expected. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something darker. His gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment before it turned to her eyes, and Elena felt her cheeks burn. The man who'd been with him cleared his throat loudly. Alexander, the board meeting. Get out, Richards. Alexander's command was sharp, but his eyes never left Elena's face. We'll continue this later. Elena heard footsteps retreating, but she couldn't look away from Alexander's piercing stare. The air between them felt electric, charged with something she didn't understand but could feel in every nerve ending. How old are you? He asked, his voice softer now but no less intense. 23. The words came out breathier than she intended. And you came from Tennessee, a small town you probably never heard of. She finally managed to take a step back, breaking the spell of his touch, though she could still feel the warmth of his hands on her skin. Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Try me. Millerville, population 800 on a good day. This time he did smile, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and infinitely more dangerous to her peace of mind. You're right. I've never heard of it. Elena bent to collect her scattered supplies, grateful for an excuse to break eye contact. But as she knelt, she was acutely aware of him watching her every movement. When she stood, he was still there, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Miss Chung will have given you the rules about my private quarters, he said, his business mask sliding back into place. Yes, sir. Good. He turned to leave, then paused. Elena, the way he said her name, with that slight emphasis on the second syllable, made something flutter in her chest. Yes, sir. Welcome to New York. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Elena stood frozen in the living room, her heart pounding against her ribs. In less than 5 minutes, Alexander Sterling had shattered every preconception she'd had about him. He wasn't the cold, distant businessman from the magazines. He was magnetic, intense, and utterly dangerous to everything she'd come here to accomplish. She spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on her work, but her mind kept replaying their encounter, the way his eyes had held hers, the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, the way her name had sounded in his deep voice. All of it swirled through her thoughts like a dangerous current. By afternoon, she'd convinced herself she'd imagined the electricity between them. Men like Alexander Sterling didn't notice women like her. She was here to work, earn money for her family, and return home. Nothing more. But as she cleaned the library that evening, she found a note tucked between 2 books. Dinner is at 8. Join me. Yes. Elena stared at the elegant handwriting, her pulse racing. This was exactly what Miss Chun had warned her about. The rules were clear. No personal interaction with Mr. Sterling. Yet as 8 o'clock approached, she found herself standing at the crossroads between duty and desire, holding a note that could change everything. Elena stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling as she applied a hint of lip gloss, the only makeup she owned. The dinner invitation burned in her pocket, like a secret she wasn't supposed to keep. Every rational thought screamed that she should ignore it, finish her work, and retreat to her room. But something deeper, more primal, pulled her toward the dining room like a moth to flame. At exactly 8 o'clock, she found Alexander standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her as he gazed out at the glittering city below. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a charcoal cashmere sweater that hugged his broad shoulders in ways that made her mouth go dry. His reflection in the glass caught her approach, and he turned slowly, his gray eyes drinking in her simple black dress, the only semi-formal thing she owned. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, his voice low and intimate in the dimly lit space. I probably shouldn't have. The honesty slipped out before she could stop it. A dangerous smile played at the corners of his mouth. Probably not. He moved toward her with the fluid grace of a predator, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. But I'm glad you did. The dining table had been set for two, candles flickering between them as they sat across from each other. Elena had never felt more out of place or more alive. The meal, prepared by his private chef, was exquisite, but she barely tasted it. Too aware of the way Alexander's eyes followed her every movement, the way his fingers drummed against his wine glass when she spoke. "Tell me about Tennessee," he said, leaning back in his chair with predatory patience. "What do you want to know?" Elena tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit that made his eyes darken. Everything. The single word hung between them, loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with geography. So she told him about summer nights catching fireflies, about her grandmother's peach cobbler, about the way the mountains looked at sunrise. And he listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most fascinating person in the world, asking questions that revealed a sharp mind and unexpected curiosity about her simple life. "What about you?" she asked as they shared dessert. "What's it like being you?" Alexander's laugh was bitter. "Lonely, efficient, profitable." He met her eyes across the candlelight. "Until today, I thought that was enough." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Elena felt her pulse quicken as his hand moved across the table, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that sent electricity shooting up her arm. "Elena," he murmured, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. The spell was broken by the sharp click of heels on marble. They jerked apart as a stunning blonde swept into the dining room, her designer dress probably costing more than Elena made in a year. Madison Whitmore moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in her perfectly curated life. "Darling, I hope you don't mind me using my key," Madison purred, her ice blue eyes taking in the intimate dinner scene with calculating precision. "I want to discuss the charity gala seating arrangements." Alexander's expression shifted instantly, the warm man for moments before disappearing behind a mask of cool professionalism. "Madison, I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly." Madison's gaze shifted to Elena with the kind of dismissive look reserved for something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. "And you are—" "This is Elena, the new housekeeper," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. But Elena caught the slight emphasis on housekeeper, and it cut deeper than she expected. "How quaint." Madison's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Well, don't let me interrupt your staff meeting." Elena stood quickly, her cheeks burning with humiliation. "I should go. Thank you for dinner, Mr. Sterling." As she hurried toward the door, she heard Madison's perfectly modulated voice. "Really, Alexander, dining with the help? People might get the wrong idea." Elena didn't wait to hear his response. She fled to her room, her heart pounding with a mixture of embarrassment and something that felt dangerously like heartbreak. Of course, he had a fiancée, someone from his world, someone who belonged in penthouse dining rooms and charity galas. The next morning, Elena threw herself into her work with determined focus. She arrived early, before Alexander left for his office, and made sure to be invisible whenever he was around. But she couldn't stop herself from watching when she thought he wasn't looking, memorizing the way he moved, the way his brow furrowed when he was thinking, the rare moments when his guard dropped and she glimpsed the man beneath the billionaire facade. Alexander, for his part, seemed to be everywhere she was. When she cleaned the library, he appeared with documents to review. When she dusted his home office, he found urgent calls that required his presence. Their eyes would meet across rooms, holding for heartbeats too long before one of them looked away. The tension built like a gathering storm. Elena would catch him staring when she bent to pick up something, his gaze lingering on the curve of her neck or the way her uniform dress hugged her hips. In return, she found herself stealing glances at his hands as he worked, wondering what they would feel like against her skin, remembering the warmth of his touch from their first meeting. 3 days after the disastrous dinner, Elena was cleaning Alexander's bathroom, a space so luxurious it rivaled most people's bedrooms, when she heard the shower running. Steam filled the air, carrying a scent, and she hurried to finish and escape before he emerged. But as she turned to leave, The shower door opened. Alexander stepped out, water droplets cascading down his muscled chest. A towel wrapped low around his hips. Their eyes met in the mirror, and time seemed to stop. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she took in sight of him. Broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist, skin bronze and perfect, except for a thin scar along his ribs that somehow made him even more compelling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. "Are you?" His voice was rough, and he turned to face her fully. Water still clung to his skin, and Elena felt her mouth go dry as her gaze traveled over the planes of his chest, the defined muscles of his abdomen, the dangerous territory where the towel hung precariously low. "I should go," she said, but the words came out breathless and unconvincing. "Should?" He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his dark lashes, could feel the heat radiating from his still warm skin. "That word keeps coming up between us. Because it's true." But even as she said it, she didn't move away. "Is it?" His hand came up to touch her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "Or is it just easier than admitting what's really happening here?" Elena's eyes fluttered closed at his touch, her body betraying every rational thought in her head. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Completely insane." But instead of pulling away, he leaned closer until she could feel his breath against her lips, until the space between them became charged with electricity and want and the kind of need that made smart people do stupid things. The spell was broken by the sharp ring of his phone from the bedroom. Alexander cursed softly, his hand falling away from her face as reality crashed back over them. "You should go," he said, but his eyes said the opposite. Elena nodded and fled, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, replaying every second of their encounter, the memory of his almost touch burning against her skin like a brand. That evening, she found a single red rose on her pillow with a note. "I can't stop thinking about you." Elena held the flower to her chest, torn between elation and terror. She was falling for a man who was engaged to someone else, a man whose world she could never truly belong to, a man who could destroy her with a single word. But as she drifted off to sleep that night, the rose on her nightstand and his words echoing in her mind, she knew it was already too late to turn back. Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle that probably cost more than her monthly salary, then settled beside her on the plush sofa, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, but not quite touching. The distance felt like a chasm and a lifeline all at once. "Tell me about the tornado," he said quietly, and Elena was surprised by how easily she found herself opening up to him. She told him about being 12 years old, huddled in the storm cellar with her family, while the world exploded above them, about emerging to find their barn destroyed, their crops ruined, her father crying for the first time she'd ever seen, about how storms still made her feel like that terrified little girl, even though she knew it was irrational. "It's not irrational," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "Fear doesn't follow logic. I should know." The rose had been on Elena's nightstand for 3 days, its petals beginning to wilt like her resolve. She'd thrown herself into work with desperate intensity, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, organizing spaces that were perfectly arranged, anything to avoid the electric moments when she and Alexander occupied the same room. But he was everywhere, in the way his cologne lingered in his office long after he'd left, in the way he'd started leaving his coffee cup in places only she would find it still warm, as if he just missed her on purpose, in the way she catch glimpses of him through doorways, his gray eyes searching for something or someone. The storm that had been brewing over Manhattan all week finally broke on Friday evening. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows with violent intensity, and thunder rolled across the sky like an angry god's warning. Elena had always hated storms. They reminded her of the tornado that had nearly destroyed her family's farm when she was 12, leaving her with a fear she'd never quite conquered. She was in the kitchen, trying to distract herself by preparing dinner, when the lights flickered. The thunder crashed again, closer this time, and she jumped, nearly dropping the wine glass she'd been washing. "Easy." Alexander's voice came from behind her, low and soothing. She spun around to find him leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. "It's just a storm." "I know," she said, but her voice betrayed her, trembling like her hands. Storms make me nervous." Another flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen in stark white, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the entire building. Elena flinched, and Alexander was beside her instantly, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "Hey," he murmured, his voice gentle in a way that made her heart ache. "You're safe. We're 68 floors up. Nothing can touch us here." But his touch was touching her everywhere, sending warmth through her body despite the chill of fear. She looked up into his gray eyes and saw something that made her breath catch. Not just desire, but genuine concern, protective instincts that transformed his austere features into something almost tender. "Where's everyone?" she asked, suddenly aware of how quiet the penthouse was. "I sent the staff home early because of the weather warnings. Ms. Chun left hours ago." His thumbs traced small circles on her shoulders, and Elena wondered if he realized he was doing it. "It's just us." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Just us. No interruptions. No rules. No witnesses to whatever might happen in this suspended moment above the storm-dark city. "I should go to my room," Elena whispered, but she made no move to step away from his touch. "Should," Alexander repeated, that word that had become their private joke, their shared acknowledgement of all the things they weren't supposed to want. But the storm's getting worse. "You shouldn't be alone if it frightens you." As if summoned by his words, another crash of thunder shook the windows. Elena gasped, instinctively pressing closer to Alexander's solid warmth. His arms came around her without hesitation, pulling her against his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath the expensive cotton of his shirt. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get away from these windows." He led her to the living room, where a fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. When had he lit that? Casting dancing shadows across the walls. The storm raged beyond the glass. But here, in this cocoon of warmth and flickering light, Elena felt safe for the first time in days. "What are you afraid of?" Elena asked, emboldened by wine and intimacy in the way the firelight made his eyes look almost golden. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, this," he said simply. "What's happening between us? The way you make me feel things I swore I'd never feel again." Elena's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Alexander set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully, his expression raw and unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "I was engaged once before. Really engaged, not like this arrangement with Madison. Her name was Sarah, and I thought she loved me, the real me, not just the money and power. But when the tabloids started digging into her past, when things got complicated, she disappeared, took a settlement check, and vanished without a word." "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, her heart breaking for the pain she could see etched in his features. "I swore after that I'd never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again. Business arrangements only. Clean, simple, profitable." His laugh was bitter. "Then you walked into my life, and suddenly nothing is simple anymore." The confession hung between them like a bridge, and Elena felt herself leaning forward, drawn by his vulnerability, by the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and terrifying and essential all at once. "Alexander," she breathed, and his name on her lips seemed to undo something in him. He reached for her face, his palm cupping her cheek with devastating gentleness. "I know this is wrong," he whispered. "I know I should stay away from you. But God help me, Elena, I can't." "Then don't," she said, and the words were barely out of her mouth before his lips were on hers. The kiss was everything she'd imagined and nothing she could have prepared for. Soft at first, questioning, giving her a chance to pull away. But when she melted into him instead, when her hands fisted in his shirt to pull him closer, he deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own. He tasted like wine and sin and promises she knew he shouldn't make. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head to deepen their connection, and Elena felt herself drowning in sensation. The warmth of his mouth, the strength of his arms around her, the way he whispered her name against her lips like a prayer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena felt dizzy with want and wine and the magnitude of what just happened between them. "Elena," Alexander said, his voice rough with desire and something that might have been regret. "We can't." "I know," she said quickly, before he could finish the thought, before he could take back the most perfect moment of her life. "I know all the reasons why this is impossible. But right now, with the storm and the fire and the way you're looking at me, right now, I don't care about impossible." Something shifted in his eyes, something that looked like surrender and triumph and terror all rolled into one. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured, but his hands were already reaching for her again. "Probably," Elena agreed, and then his mouth was on hers again, and thinking became impossible. They kissed until the wine made them dizzy, until the fire burned low in the grate, until the storm outside seemed like nothing compared to the tempest building between them. When Alexander finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with want, and his breath came in uneven gasps. "We should stop," he said, but his hands were tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, contradicting his words with every touch. "We should," Elena agreed, but she was leaning into his touch, her body betraying every rational thought in her head. They might have crossed every line that night, might have given in completely to the desire that burned between them like wildfire. But the shrill ring of Alexander's phone cut through the intimate atmosphere like a knife. He cursed softly, checking the caller ID, and his expression darkened. "Madison," he said, and the name fell between them like a stone. Elena pulled back instantly, the spell broken, reality crashing over her like cold water. Of course, his fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman from his world who belonged in penthouses and charity galas. "Answer it," Elena said, standing on unsteady legs. "You have to." But as she walked toward her room, she heard him decline the call, heard him whisper her name like a man drowning. In her bedroom, Elena pressed her fingers to her lips, still able to taste him, still feeling the ghost of his touch on her skin. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but she knew the real storm was just beginning, because she was falling in love with Alexander Sterling, and that was the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. The weekend after the storm passed in a haze of stolen glances and electric tension that seemed to charge the very air of the penthouse, Elena found herself moving through her duties like a woman possessed, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every possibility that Alexander might appear around the next corner. He was different now, more intense, more focused on her in ways that made her skin burn under his gaze. When she cleaned his office Monday morning, she found fresh roses on his desk, their petals scattered like secrets across important documents. When she dusted the library, she discovered poetry books left open to passages about forbidden love, margins marked in his precise handwriting. But it was the way he looked at her that nearly undid her completely. Gone was any pretense of professional distance. His gray eyes followed her movements with predatory hunger, drinking in every curve, every gesture, as if he were memorizing her for when she was gone. The air between them crackled with unfinished business, with the memory of his mouth on hers, and all the things they hadn't done in the firelight. Tuesday morning, Elena was arranging fresh flowers in the lobby when she heard masculine laughter echoing from the elevator bank. She glanced up to see James, the building's head doorman, helping her with a heavy crystal vase. At 28, James was handsome in an easy, approachable way. Sandy brown hair, warm brown eyes, and a smile that had probably charmed half the women in Manhattan. "You know, Elena," James said, his voice carrying a slight Brooklyn accent that reminded her of home movies, "I've been meaning to ask, would you like to grab coffee sometime? There's this great little place in the village that serves the best apple cinnamon muffins this side of heaven." Elena felt her cheeks warm at the invitation. James was kind, uncomplicated, available, everything Alexander wasn't. "That sounds lovely," she began, but her words were cut short by a voice like winter steel. "Rodriguez." Elena spun around to find Alexander standing in the doorway of his private elevator, his expression thunderous. He was dressed impeccably as always, charcoal suit, steel gray tie, but there was something wild in his eyes that made her pulse quicken with equal parts excitement and fear. "Mr. Sterling," she said carefully, acutely aware of James standing beside her, of the way Alexander's gaze flipped between them like a man calculating threats. "My office. Now." The command was delivered in a tone that brooked no argument, but Elena caught the slight emphasis on my that sent heat shooting through her veins. James cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I should get back to work. Think about that coffee, Elena." As James disappeared into the elevator, Elena found herself alone with Alexander, who was looking at her like she'd just committed high treason. The silence stretched between them, dangerous and electric, until she couldn't bear it anymore. "What's wrong?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "What's wrong?" Alexander's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. "I just watched another man ask out the woman I can't stop thinking about, and you looked like you were about to say yes." The raw possessiveness in his voice made Elena's knees weak, but she forced herself to stand straighter. "And what if I was? You're engaged, Alexander, to someone else." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, frustration, desire so intense it was almost violent. "Don't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't throw Madison in my face right now." "Why not? She's your fiancée. She has every right to—" "She has rights to my name and my money," Alexander cut her off, moving closer with each word until Elena found herself backed against the marble wall of the lobby. "But she doesn't have this." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with devastating gentleness that contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes. "She doesn't make me lose control. She doesn't make me forget every rule I've ever made for myself. She doesn't make me want to burn down everything I built just for one more taste." Elena's breath caught at the confession, at the way his body pressed close enough that she could feel his heat, smell his cologne, see the gold flecks in his gray eyes. "Alexander, I know it's selfish," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more intimate than shouting. "I know I have no right to ask this of you, but don't go out with him. Elena, don't let another man touch what's mine." The possessive claim should have offended her feminist sensibilities. Instead, it sent liquid fire coursing through her veins, pooling low at her belly with a want so intense it was almost painful. "I'm not yours," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. Alexander's smile was predatory, triumphant. "Aren't you?" Before she could answer, his mouth was on hers, harder and more desperate than their first kiss by the fire. This wasn't the gentle exploration of that stormy night. This was claiming, possessing, marking territory with lips and teeth and tongue until Elena forgot her own name. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his jacket to pull him closer, needing more contact, more heat, more of everything he was offering. He tasted like coffee and mint and dangerous promises, and she wanted to drown in him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander's eyes were dark with desire and something that looked almost like pain. "Tell me you're mine," he demanded, his voice rough with need. Elena looked up at him. This powerful, complicated, impossible man who was asking her to be something she couldn't be, to want something she couldn't have. "You know I can't," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was too late. She was his, had been since that first moment when he caught her in his arms. The knowledge terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Alexander seemed to read the truth in her eyes because his expression softened, became almost tender. "Come with me," he said, taking her hand. "I want to show you something." He led her to his private library, a room she cleaned countless times but never really seen. Not like this, with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows and dust motes dancing in golden beams. Alexander moved one of the shelves and pulled out a slim volume bound in worn leather. "My mother's journal," he explained, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She died when I was 15. Brain cancer. This is one of the few things I have left of her." Elena accepted the journal with reverent hands, understanding instinctively that he was sharing something precious, something he'd probably never shown anyone else. The pages fell open to an entry dated 23 years ago, written in elegant script that looked like Alexander's handwriting feminized. "Read it," he said quietly. Elena's eyes moved over the words, her heart clenching as she absorbed their meaning. "I fear I'm failing him. Alexander builds walls around his heart like castles, And I don't know how to show him that love isn't conquest. It's surrender. I pray someday he'll find someone who makes him want to lower his defenses, someone who sees a man beneath the armor. She would have liked you, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. She would like the way you see through all the bullshit to who I really am. Elena looked up from the journal to find him watching her with an expression so vulnerable it made her chest ache. This was Alexander without his masks, without his walls, just a man who'd lost his mother too young and built an empire to fill the void. Alexander, she whispered, reaching for him. But before she could touch him, before she could offer comfort or understanding or the connection they both desperately needed, voices echoed from the main hallway. Madison's laugh, sharp and artificial, accompanied by the click of expensive heels on marble. "Darling, I brought the wedding planner," Madison called out. "We need to finalize the seating arrangements for her." She appeared in the library doorway and stopped dead, taking the intimate tableau. Alexander and Elena standing close together, the journal in Elena's hands, the unmistakable charge in the air between them. "How cozy," Madison said, her voice dripping ice. "I didn't realize housekeepers provided literary discussion as part of their services." Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and something darker, jealousy, pure and vicious, at seeing this perfect woman who belonged in Alexander's world in ways she never could. "Madison," Alexander said carefully, moving slightly in front of Elena in an unconsciously protective gesture that made Madison's eyes narrow dangerously. "Don't," Madison said, her composure cracking slightly. "Don't you dare protect her from me. I know exactly what's happening here, and it ends now." She turned her laser focus on Elena, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "How much?" she asked bluntly. "I'm sorry." Elena's voice came out smaller than she intended. "How much to disappear? To quit this job and go back to whatever little town you crawled out of? Name your price. I'm sure it's considerably less than what this little fantasy is going to cost everyone involved." The words hit Elena like physical blows, each one designed to remind her exactly how far she was from belonging in this world of private elevators and charity galas and women who could buy people like groceries. "Madison, that's enough." Alexander's voice was deadly quiet, but his fiancée ignored him. 50,000? 100? I'm sure that's more money than you've ever seen in your pathetic little life." Elena felt something inside her crack. All the insecurities and self-doubt she'd been fighting crystallizing into sharp-edged reality. Madison was right. She didn't belong here. Didn't belong with Alexander. Didn't belong in a world where love could be bought and sold like commodities. "You're right," Elena said quietly, setting the journal carefully on the nearest shelf. This was a mistake. "Elena, don't," Alexander said, but she was already moving toward the door, away from him, away from the impossible dream she'd been stupid enough to believe in. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she wasn't sure she was apologizing to him or to herself for being foolish enough to think fairy tales could come true. As she walked away, she heard Madison's satisfied laughter echoing behind her, the sound following her all the way to her room where she collapsed on her bed and finally let herself cry for everything she'd lost before she'd ever really had it. 3 days of silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elena threw herself into work with mechanical precision, arriving before dawn and staying late into the evening, anything to avoid the possibility of running into Alexander. But the penthouse felt different now, charged with unspoken words and unfulfilled promises that seemed to pulse through the very walls. She'd seen him only in glimpses. His silhouette in the home office late at night, the sound of his voice echoing from conference calls, the lingering scent of his cologne in rooms she entered just after he'd left. It was torture of the sweetest kind, this dance of avoidance that felt more intimate than any embrace. Thursday morning, Elena was polishing the marble countertops in the kitchen when Ms. Chen appeared, her usual composed expression slightly strained. "Pack an overnight bag," she said without preamble. "Mr. Sterling needs you to accompany him to Napa Valley for a business weekend. You'll be leaving in 2 hours." Elena's claw stilled against the marble. "I'm sorry, what?" "His regular assistant is ill, and he specifically requested you accompany him to assist with household needs during the meetings." Ms. Chen's tone suggested she found this highly irregular, but wasn't paid enough to question Alexander Sterling's decisions. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. A weekend alone with Alexander, away from the suffocating presence of Madison and the rules that govern their interactions in Manhattan. It was either the answer to her prayers or a recipe for complete disaster. "I don't think that's appropriate," Elena managed. Ms. Chen's smile was thin. "Mr. Sterling rarely asks twice. The car will be here at 11. 2 hours later, Elena found herself in the back of a sleek black Mercedes, her small overnight bag feeling pathetic next to Alexander's expensive leather luggage. He sat across from her, ostensibly working on his laptop, but she could feel his gaze on her like a physical caress every time she looked out the window. The drive to the private airfield passed in charred silence. Alexander's jet was a study in understated luxury. Cream leather seats, polished with accents, and windows that offered breathtaking views of the countryside as they climbed into the afternoon sky. "Why did you really bring me?" Elena asked once they were airborne, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. Alexander closed his laptop and looked at her directly for the first time in days. His gray eyes were dark with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I couldn't stand another day of pretending I don't need you there." The honesty in his voice made her chest tight, with longing and fear in equal measure. "Alexander, what happened with Madison?" "It was a mistake," he cut her off. "I should have protected you better. I should have ended that engagement months ago instead of hiding behind convenient arrangements. But you didn't." The words came out sharper than she intended, but 3 days of hurt and confusion had left their mark. "No," he agreed quietly. "I didn't, and I hate myself for that cowardice." The admission hung between them as the jet carried them west, toward whatever waited them in the California wine country. Elena stared out the window at clouds that looked like cotton candy, trying to reconcile the powerful man beside her with the vulnerability she heard in his voice. Sterling Vineyard sat nestled in rolling hills covered with neat rows of grapevines, the late afternoon sun turning everything golden and magical. Alexander's business weekend was apparently a merger discussion with another tech mogul who diversified into wine, but the setting felt more like a romantic getaway than a corporate meeting. The guest house where they'd be staying was a study in rustic elegance. Exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the vineyard. It was intimate in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken and her common sense scream warnings. "There's only one bedroom," Elena observed, standing frozen in the doorway. "I can sleep on the couch," Alexander said, but his voice suggested he had no intention of doing any such thing. The evening began innocently enough. Alexander's business dinner was held at the main house, a sprawling estate where California's tech elite mingled over wine that cost more per bottle than Elena made in a week. She dressed in the only cocktail dress she owned. Simple black, bought secondhand but elegant enough that she didn't feel completely out of place among the designer gowns. But she felt Alexander's eyes on her all evening, tracking her movements as she played the part as assistant, taking notes and managing his schedule. When she bent to retrieve a dropped pen, she heard his sharp intake of breath. When she leaned close to whisper a reminder about his next appointment, she saw his hands clench into fists as if he were fighting the urge to touch her. The wine tasting afterward was Elena's undoing. She'd never developed a taste for alcohol. Growing up poor didn't leave much room for expensive habits, but the vintages being poured were liquid silk, each sip more intoxicating than the last. "This one's my favorite," Alexander murmured, appearing beside her as she sampled a deep red that tasted like dark chocolate and forbidden promises. Cabernet Sauvignon, aged 15 years. Smooth, complex, with hints of berry and spice. He was standing close enough that she could feel his breath against her ear, and Elena had to grip the tasting glass to keep her hand steady. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, but when she looked up, he was staring at her, not the wine. "It is." The tension that had been building all day finally snapped. Without conscious thought, Elena found herself leaning into his warmth, and Alexander's arm came around her waist, pulling her against his side with possessive certainty. They made it through the rest of the evening somehow, playing their roles of boss and assistant even as electricity crackled between them. But when they finally returned to the guest house, wine-flushed and dizzy with want, all pretense crumbled. "Elena," Alexander said as she fumbled with the key to their door, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. She turned to find him right behind her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could count the dark lashes that framed them. "We shouldn't," she whispered, but even as she said it, her hands were reaching for him. "I know," he breathed, his fingers tangling in her hair, "but I can't fight this anymore. I can't pretend I don't want you more than I've ever wanted anything." This time, when his mouth found hers, there was no hesitation, no holding back. He kissed her like a man claiming what was his, like a man who'd been starving and had finally found sustenance. Elena melted into him, her body coming alive under his touch in ways she'd never experienced. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips, giving her one last chance to retreat, to maintain the safe distance they'd been struggling with for weeks. Instead of answering with words, Elena reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling but determined. Alexander's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. They were past the point of no return. He lifted her easily, carrying her to the bedroom where moonlight streamed through tall windows, silvering everything in ethereal light. When he set her down beside the bed, his hands shook as he reached for the zipper of her dress. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with reverence and desire. "So perfect." The dress puddled at her feet, and Elena felt a moment of vulnerability, standing before the sophisticated man in her simple undergarments. But the way Alexander looked at her, like she was something precious and miraculous, banished all self-consciousness. His clothes followed hers to the floor, revealing the body she'd glimpsed in his bathroom weeks ago, but could now explore with reverent hands. He was magnificent. All lean muscle and warm skin, perfect except for that thin scar along his ribs that she traced with wondering fingers. "Car accident when I was 22, he explained, shivering under her touch. "Nearly died. Sometimes I think I did die, and I've been walking through life like a ghost ever since. Until you..." The confession broke something open in Elena's chest, and she reached up to pull him down to her, needing to show him with her body what words couldn't express. They came together with desperate hunger, months of denied attraction, finally finding release in whispered endearments and gasps of pleasure. Alexander worshipped her body with a patience that drove her to the edge of madness, learning every curve, every sensitive spot, until Elena was trembling beneath him, completely undone. When they finally joined, it was a connection so profound it felt spiritual, two souls recognizing their missing piece. Afterward, they lay entwined in moonlight and silk sheets, Elena's head on Alexander's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she never felt more complete or more terrified. "What happens now?" she whispered into the darkness. Alexander was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't go back to pretending you don't own every piece of me." Elena pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart, and tried not to think about Monday morning, about Madison, about all the reasons this perfect moment couldn't last. For now, it was enough to lie in his arms and pretend that love could conquer the vast differences between their worlds. But even as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that their stolen weekend was borrowed time, and soon the real world would come crashing back to claim them both. The morning after paradise broke with the harsh ring of Alexander's phone. Elena stirred in his arms, silk sheets tangled around her bare body, sunlight streaming through the vineyard windows like liquid gold. For one perfect moment, she felt nothing but contentment. Alexander's warmth surrounding her, his steady breathing against her hair, the delicious ache in her body that reminded her of their night together. Then Alexander's sharp intake of breath shattered the illusion. "What the hell do you mean? It's everywhere." His voice was deadly quiet, but Elena could feel the tension coiling through his body like a spring about to snap. Elena sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, as Alexander swung out of bed and began pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. Even naked and disheveled, he commanded attention, all lean muscle and controlled fury as he listened to whatever crisis was unfolding on the other end of the line. How many publications? Pause. Jesus Christ. Another pause, Longer this time. I don't care what it costs. Kill the story before it spreads further. But Elena could see from his expression that it was already too late. Whatever it was, it already escaped containment, spreading through the media ecosystem like wildfire. "Alexander," she said softly, but he held up a hand, still listening intently. "No, absolutely not. Under no circumstances do you confirm or deny anything. And find out who the source was." Someone had to tip them off. His gray eyes found Elena's across the room, and she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. "I'll be back in New York in 3 hours." He ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, his back to her, every line of his body radiating controlled violence. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, though dread was already pooling in her stomach. Alexander turned, and his expression was the careful mask of the businessman. Nothing left of the vulnerable man who'd held her through the night. "Someone photographed us last night, kissing by the tasting room, walking back to the guest house. The pictures are all over the tabloids." Elena felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "Billionaire's secret affair with the help," Alexander quoted, his voice flat. "Sterling scandalous weekend with mystery brunette. They don't have your name yet, but it's only a matter of time." Elena pulled the sheet tighter around herself, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. "How is that possible?" "We were careful. Apparently not careful enough." Alexander was already moving, pulling on clothes with efficient, angry movements. Someone with a telephoto lens, probably. Hell, for all we know, the whole weekend was a setup. The accusation hit Elena like a physical blow. "You think I—" "No," Alexander said quickly, but the hesitation before the word cut deep. "No, of course not. But someone knew we'd be here. Someone tipped off the photographers." Elena's mind raced through the possibilities, but they all led to the same conclusion. Someone wanted to destroy what they'd found together, and they'd succeeded spectacularly. "What does this mean?" she whispered. Alexander's laugh was bitter. "It means my board of directors is probably convening an emergency meeting as we speak. It means Madison is going to be out for blood. It means everything we've built." "Everything you built," Elena corrected, the distinction suddenly crucial. "This is your world, your life. I'm just a housemaid who got caught in the crossfire." Something flickered across Alexander's face. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. "Is that really what you think?" "That last night meant nothing." "I think last night was beautiful," Elena said, tears threatening. "And I think it's going to destroy both of us." The flight back to Manhattan passed in tense silence. Alexander worked furiously on his laptop, while Elena stared out the window, watching the landscape blur beneath them. She could feel him retreating with every passing mile, pulling back into the safety of his corporate persona, building walls between them brick by brick. When they landed, 3 black SUVs waited on the tarmac. Not the usual understated luxury, but the kind of security detail reserved for genuine crises. Alexander's jaw tightened as he saw them. "Alexander," Elena started, but he was already moving, his phone buzzing with calls he couldn't ignore. "We'll talk later," he said without looking at her, and Elena knew with sinking certainty that later might never come. The penthouse felt like a war zone. Ms. Chin met them at the elevator with a stack of newspapers, her usual composure cracked with stress. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," she reported tersely. "Legal wants to see you immediately. And Ms. Whitmore is waiting in your office." Elena felt her stomach drop. Of course Madison was here. Of course she'd seen the photos, read the headlines, connected the dots that would unravel everything. "Elena, go to your room," Alexander ordered, but his tone was distant, professional. The boss dismissing the help. "Don't answer your phone. Don't speak to anyone." Elena nodded mutely and escaped to her quarters, but she could hear voices rising from Alexander's office. Madison's shrill accusations, Alexander controlled responses, the sound of something expensive being thrown against a wall. She tried to follow his instructions, tried to hide in her room, and wait for the storm to pass. But 20 minutes later, Madison appeared in her doorway like an avenging angel in designer clothing. Well, Madison purred, her perfect face twisted with malicious satisfaction. The little country mouse who thought she could play in the big city. Elena stood slowly, trying to summon whatever dignity she had left. Madison. Oh, we're past formalities now, don't you think? After all, you've been fucking my fiancé. The crude word sounded obscene in Madison's cultured accent, deliberately chosen to wound. Elena flinched, but held her ground. What do you want? Madison smiled, predatory and cold. I want you to understand exactly what you've walked into. Do you know how much Alexander's company stock has dropped in the last hour? 12%. Do you know how much this merger with my father's company is worth? $2 billion. And do you know what happens to little girls who threaten billion-dollar deals? Elena felt ice forming in her veins, but she kept her voice steady. Enlighten me. They disappear. Madison moved closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown. Not literally, of course. We're not barbarians. But financially, socially, professionally, it's amazing how quickly a person can become unemployable, unmarketable, invisible. Madison pulled out her phone and showed Elena a screen filled with her own image. The photos from Napa, but also others. Elena leaving her family's farm. Elena boarding the bus to New York. Elena's mother at the hospital where she worked as a cleaning lady. We know everything about you, Elena Rodriguez. Your family's financial troubles, your father's gambling debts, your mother's medical bills. It would be such a shame if her employer suddenly found reasons to terminate her. If your father's creditors decided to call in their loans. If your little sister's scholarship to community college mysteriously disappeared. Elena's legs nearly gave out. You can't. I can do whatever I want, Madison said sweetly. I have money, connections, and a very long memory. But I'm not unreasonable. I'm prepared to make you an offer. She pulled out a check, already filled out, and Elena's eyes widened at the number zeros. $500,000. Enough to pay off your family's debts, get your mother the medical care she needs, secure your sister's education. All you have to do is disappear. Leave New York, leave Alexander, and never contact him again. Elena stared at the check, her mind reeling. $500,000. More money than her family would see in 10 lifetimes. Enough to solve every problem, heal every wound, secure every future. And if I don't, she whispered. Madison's smile turned razor sharp. Then your family suffers the consequences of your selfish choices. Your mother loses her job and her insurance. Your father's debts get called in and he loses the farm. Your sister watches her dreams of college disappear. And you get to live with the knowledge that you chose a man who was never really yours over the people who actually need you. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of Madison. Not when she was being backed into a corner with surgical precision. I need time to think. No, Madison cut her off. You don't, because while we've been chatting, Alexander has been in crisis meetings with his board, his lawyers, and his investors. And do you know what conclusion they've reached? Elena's heart stopped. The merger can only be saved if Alexander publicly distances himself from the scandal, which means he's about to hold a press conference downstairs, where he'll categorically deny any romantic involvement with his household staff, where he'll reaffirm his commitment to our engagement and our upcoming wedding, where he'll make it crystal clear that you were nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment that he deeply regrets. The words hit Elena like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to break her resolve, to make her understand exactly how little she meant in the grand scheme of Alexander's world. You're lying, Elena whispered. Madison's laugh was like broken glass. Am I? Let's go watch, shall we? Elena followed Madison to the main living area, where a massive television displayed a live news feed. Alexander stood behind a podium in the building's lobby, surrounded by reporters and cameras, his expression carved from stone. I want to address the rumors circulating in the media today, he began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. The photos you've seen represent nothing more than a professional relationship that was misinterpreted by opportunistic photographers. Elena felt her world crumbling around her as the man she loved, the man who'd whispered endearments against her skin just hours ago, systematically dismantled everything they'd shared. Ms. Rodriguez is an employee of my household staff. Nothing more. Any suggestion of impropriety is categorically false and deeply unfair to both Ms. Rodriguez and my fiancée, Madison Whitmore, to whom I am completely committed. The cameras flashed like lightning, and Elena saw her own death in her strobing light. The death of her dreams, her hopes, her foolish belief that love could bridge the chasm between their worlds. I deeply regret that my momentary lapse in professional boundaries has caused distress to everyone involved, Alexander continued, and Elena could hear Madison's satisfied sigh behind her. Moving forward, I will be implementing stricter policies regarding staff interactions to ensure this never happens again. Elena turned away before he could say more, before he could drive the knife any deeper. Madison's check lay on the coffee table like a lifeline and a death sentence combined. Still think he loves you? Madison asked softly, her voice almost gentle now that victory was assured. Elena picked up the check with trembling fingers, her signature barely legible through her tears. As she signed away the only real happiness she'd ever known, she tried to remember Alexander's face in the moonlight, his whispered promises, the way he'd held her like she was something precious. But all she could hear was his voice on the television, cold and professional and utterly convincing, as he erased her from his life with surgical precision. 2 hours later, Elena Rodriguez walked out of the Sterling building for the last time, a suitcase in one hand and a check for her family's future in the other, leaving behind the only man she'd ever loved and the shattered pieces of her heart. 6 months. 183 days since Elena Rodriguez had walked out of his life, taking every shred of light and warmth with her. Alexander Sterling stood in his empty penthouse, staring out the Manhattan skyline that no longer held any beauty for him, and wonder how a man could be surrounded by everything he'd ever wanted and still feel like he was dying inside. The merger had failed anyway. Madison's father had pulled out 2 weeks after the press conference, citing concerns about leadership stability. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander. He'd sacrificed the only real thing in his life to save a deal that had crumbled to dust the moment he betrayed his own heart. Madison had lasted another month after that, her interest waning with the business prospects. She returned the engagement ring with a note that read simply, "You were never really mine anyway. We both know who you belong to." Even his calculated fiancée had seen what he'd been too cowardly to fight for. Now his penthouse felt like a mausoleum, every room haunted by memories of Elena. He'd fired the entire household staff, unable to bear seeing anyone else move through spaces that belonged to her in his mind. He lived on takeout and regret, worked 18-hour days to exhaust himself enough to sleep, without dreaming of dark hair and green eyes, and the way she'd whispered his name in the moonlight. His phone buzzed with another call from his assistant. Probably another crisis that required his attention, another fire to put out in the empire he'd built in the ashes of his happiness. But Alexander let it go to voicemail, just like he had for the past week. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. The knock on his door came at exactly 9 p.m., sharp and insistent. Alexander ignored it, assuming it was another reporter or process server. But the knocking continued, accompanied by a voice he hadn't heard in months. "Open up, Alex. We need to talk." Marcus Chun, his oldest friend and former roommate from Harvard, had been trying to stage interventions for weeks now. Alexander had successfully avoided them all, but apparently Marcus had decided on a more direct approach. "Go away, Marcus," Alexander called without moving from his position by the windows. "Not happening. I have a key, remember? I helped you buy this place." The lock clicked, and Marcus strode into the penthouse like he owned it, taking in Alexander's disheveled appearance. 3 days stubble, wrinkled clothes, the general air of a man who'd given up on life. "Jesus, Alex, you look like hell. Thank you for that observation. Now leave." But Marcus wasn't deterred. He moved through the space, noting the takeout containers, the empty bottles, the newspapers scattered everywhere with headlines about Sterling Industries' declining stock prices. "You know, when I hired that private investigator, I thought it was to help you get closure. I didn't think you'd use the information to torture yourself." Alexander finally turned from the window, his gray eyes hollow. "What are you talking about?" Marcus pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents and photographs. "Elena Rodriguez, Millerville, Tennessee, population 847, Not 800 like she told you. And currently home to one very successful catering company called Elena's Kitchen. Alexander's hands shook as he reached for the folder, his heart hammering against his ribs. You had no right. I had every right. You're my friend, and you're destroying yourself over a woman you let walk away without a fight. Marcus's voice softened. Alex, there's something else. Something you need to know. Alexander opened the folder with trembling fingers. The first photograph hit him like a physical blow. Elena, more beautiful than ever despite the sadness in her eyes, standing outside a small restaurant with a painted sign that read, Elena's Kitchen, home cooking with love. She was wearing a simple sundress, her hair longer than he remembered, pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger, more vulnerable. But it was a second photograph that stopped his heart entirely. Elena was holding a baby, a little girl with dark hair and gray eyes that looked exactly like his own. Her name is Isabella, Marcus said quietly. Isabella Rose Rodriguez. Born 4 months ago. The timing. He let the implication hang in the air. Alexander's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair, staring at the photograph with a mixture of wonder and devastation that threatened to tear him apart. His daughter. Elena had been carrying his child when she'd signed that check and walked out his life. And he'd been too blind, too cowardly, too concerned with his precious reputation to see what he was losing. Why didn't she tell me? His voice came out as a broken whisper. Would you have listened? After that press conference, after you chose your board over your heart, would you have believed her if she called to say she was pregnant? Alexander closed his eyes, remembering Elena's face as he denied their relationship on live television. The way she looked at him like he'd ripped her heart out and fed it to the wolves. No, he admitted. I probably thought it was another scheme for money. The investigator says she hasn't touched the money Madison gave her. It's still sitting in a bank account, untouched. She's building her business from scratch, working 16-hour days, raising her daughter alone because she's too proud to use money that came from betrayal. Alexander studied the photographs, drinking in every detail. Elena's hands on the baby's back, protective and gentle, the way Isabella's tiny fingers gripped her mother's dress. The exhaustion etched around Elena's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and single motherhood and dreams deferred for survival. There's more, Marcus continued, his voice gentle but relentless. The farms and foreclosure. Elena's been trying to keep up the payments while building her business, but it's too much. They got 30 days before the bank takes everything. The information hit Alexander like a series of physical blows. While he'd been wallowing in his penthouse of self-pity, Elena had been fighting battles on every front. Building a business, raising their child, trying to save her family's legacy. And he'd been too lost in his own pain to even know she needed help. I have to go to her, Alexander said, standing abruptly, purpose flooding through him for the first time in months. Do you? Marcus challenged. Or are you going to swoop in with your checkbook and try to buy your way back into her life? Because I got to tell you, Alex, after what you did, after how you abandoned her when she needed you most, it's going to take a hell of a lot more than money to earn her forgiveness. Alexander looked at the photographs again, focusing on Elena's face, the strength and sadness warring in her green eyes. Marcus was right. He couldn't just throw money at this problem and expect it to disappear. He'd broken something precious, something that might be irreparable. And if he wanted any chance of winning back the only woman he'd ever loved, he was going to have to prove he was worthy of her forgiveness. Then I'll do whatever it takes, Alexander said, his voice carrying the kind of determination that had built an empire. I'll tear down every wall I built between us. I'll prove to her that I'm not the coward who chose reputation over love. And if she won't forgive you, if it's too late, Alexander studied the photograph of his daughter, this perfect little person he'd never met but already loved more than his own life. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure they never want for anything. But I have to try, Marcus. I have to fight for them the way I should have fought 6 months ago. For the first time in half a year, Alexander Sterling felt something other than despair. It was terrifying and exhilarating and probably foolish, but it was hope. Hope that love could conquer mistakes of the past. Hope that Elena might find in her heart to forgive him. Hope that he might get the chance to be the man she deserved and the father his daughter needed. He had one shot at redemption, one chance to prove that the love they'd shared in Napa Valley had been real and worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to waste it. "Book me a flight to Tennessee," Alexander said, already moving toward his bedroom to pack. "It's time I went home." "Tennessee isn't your home," Marcus pointed out. Alexander looked at the photograph one more time, at Elena's face and their daughter's tiny features, and felt something settle into place in his chest. Something that had been missing for 6 months. "No," he agreed, "but they are, and it's time I stopped running from the only thing that's ever made me whole." 2 hours later, Alexander Sterling was on a plane to Tennessee, carrying nothing but a suitcase, a folder full of photographs, and a heart full of hope that somehow, some way, love would be enough to bridge the chasm his cowardice had created. Behind him, Manhattan glittered in the darkness, a city full of ambition and success and everything he thought he wanted. But ahead of him lay something infinitely more valuable, a chance at the family he'd been too afraid to fight for, and the woman who held his heart in her hands. The reckoning was coming, and Alexander Sterling had never been more terrified or more determined in his life. The Tennessee countryside hit Alexander like a revelation. Rolling green hills stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it seemed painted, dotted with farms and forests that whispered of simpler times and deeper truths. As his rental car wound through narrow country roads toward Millerville, Alexander felt something loosening in his chest, the tight knot of anxiety and ambition that had been choking him for years. Millerville looked exactly like Elena had described it, a handful of buildings clustered around a main street that time seemed to have forgotten, where people still waved at strangers and children played in front yards without fear. Alexander parked outside Elena's kitchen, his heart hammering as he took in the cheerful painted sign, the flower boxes in the windows, the chalkboard menu advertising today's special love. Through the glass, he could see her moving between tables, taking orders with the same grace that had captivated him in his sterile Manhattan penthouse. But this Elena was different, more confident, more grounded, wearing her independence like armor. She belonged here in a way she'd never belonged in his world, and the knowledge cut deeper than any business loss he'd ever suffered. Alexander sat in his car for 20 minutes, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. Then the restaurant door opened, and Elena emerged carrying a baby carrier, and his world stopped spinning entirely. Isabella Rose Rodriguez was perfect. 4 months of pure miracle with Elena's delicate features and his gray eyes. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the way she gripped Elena's finger, the way Elena's face softened as she murmured to her daughter, and he felt his heart crack open with love and regret in equal measure. Elena looked up then, perhaps sensing she was being watched, and their eyes met across the quiet street. Alexander saw the exact moment recognition hit. The way her face went pale, the way she instinctively pulled Isabella closer, the way she looked around as if planning an escape route. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the reckoning that had been 6 months in the making. Alexander climbed out of the car slowly, his hands shaking as he approached a woman who'd haunted every dream and nightmare since she'd walked out his life. Elena stood frozen by her car, clutching Isabella's carrier like a shield, her green eyes wide with shock and something that might have been pain. "Hello, Elena," he said softly, stopping several feet away, giving her space to breathe, to run if she needed to. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath, could see the way her free hand trembled as she fumbled with her keys. "I came to meet my daughter," Alexander said simply, and watched Elena's composure crack just slightly, "and to apologize to the woman I should have fought for." Elena's laugh was bitter, defensive. 6 months too late, don't you think? "Yes," Alexander agreed, surprising her with his honesty. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days too late. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving until you hear what I have to say. I don't want to hear anything you have to say. Elena's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of several passers-by who begun to gather on the sidewalk, curious about the stranger in the expensive car talking to their Elena. "Please," Alexander said, and the word came out more broken than he'd intended. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Elena looked down at Isabella, who was beginning to fuss, then back at Alexander with eyes that held 6 months of hurt and exhaustion and stubborn strength. "Not here," she said finally. Not in front of the whole town. Follow me. She led him to a small park behind the restaurant, a peaceful place with old oak trees and a playground where children's laughter echoed in the afternoon air. Elena set Isabella's carrier on a picnic table and began rocking it gently. Her attention focused on their daughter rather than the man who traveled 1,000 miles to grovel for forgiveness. "She's beautiful," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion as he got his first real look at Isabella. The baby was awake now, staring up at her with eyes that were mirrors of his own, and Alexander felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "She looks like you." "She has your eyes," Elena said quietly, still not looking at him. "Everyone comments on them. I tell them she gets them from her grandfather." The lie hit Alexander like a physical blow, but he understood it. Of course, Elena wouldn't want to explain to her neighbors that her daughter's father was the billionaire who publicly humiliated her on national television. "Elena, I'm sorry," Alexander began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Just don't. You don't get to come here and apologize and think that makes everything okay. You destroyed me, Alexander. You looked me in the eye and told the world I meant nothing to you. You chose your precious reputation over the woman carrying your child." Each word was a knife, precisely aimed and devastatingly effective. Alexander absorbed them all, knowing he deserved every cut. "You're right," he said simply. "I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing control, of being vulnerable, that I destroyed the only thing that ever made me feel alive." Elena finally looked at him then, really looked, and Alexander saw that the months had changed her as much as they'd changed him. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a wariness that spoke of nights spent crying over a man who'd abandoned her when she needed him most. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here now after all this time?" Alexander pulled out the manila folder, extracting a single photograph. One of Elena holding Isabella outside the restaurant, both of them bathed in golden sunlight. "Because I finally realized what I'd lost. Because I've spent 6 months dying inside, and I can't do it anymore. Because our daughter deserves better than a father who was too much of a coward to fight for her mother." Elena's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she stared at the photograph. "You hired someone to spy on me. I hired someone to find you because I was too proud to do it myself," Alexander corrected. Another mistake in a long line of them. "Elena, the merger failed anyway. Madison left me. Everything I thought I was protecting turned to dust the moment I chose it over you." "Good," Elena said fiercely, wiping away her tears with angry swipes. "I'm glad you lost everything. I'm glad it all fell apart. Maybe now you know how it feels to have your world destroyed by someone you trusted." Alexander nodded, accepting her anger as his due. "I deserve that. I deserve to lose everything. But Elena, please, don't punish Isabella for my mistakes. Let me be part of her life. Let me try to make this right." Elena was quiet for a long moment, rocking Isabella's carrier as she struggled with emotions too complex for words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know what the hardest part was? Not the pregnancy alone, not building a business from nothing, not the sleepless nights or the worried looks from my family. It was watching the news coverage of your engagement party to Madison and realizing that you'd moved on like I never existed, like we never happened." Alexander's heart shattered completely. There was no engagement party. Madison and I, we were never real. Elena, it was always supposed to be a business arrangement. You were the only real thing in my life, and I was too stupid to see it until it was too late. Then why didn't you come sooner? Why wait 6 months to decide I was worth fighting for? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Alexander knew his answer would determine everything. Whether he got a second chance or spent the rest of his life regretting the greatest mistake he'd ever made. "Because I was broken," he said honestly. "Because I convinced myself I didn't deserve love, didn't deserve happiness. Because I was so afraid of being hurt again that I hurt the only person who'd ever seen past my walls to who I really was." Elena stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Truth, maybe, or the man she'd fallen in love with in a vineyard 6 months ago. "What do you want from me, Alexander?" she asked finally. "Everything," he said without hesitation. "I want to earn your forgiveness. I want to be the father Isabella deserves. I want to prove that I'm not the same coward who let you walk away. He took a shaky breath. I want another chance to love you the way I should have from the beginning. Elena closed her eyes, and Alexander could see the war being fought behind her lids. Love battling with hurt, hope wrestling with hard-won wisdom. I can't do this again, she whispered. I can't risk Isabella getting attached to you just to have you disappear when things get complicated. I can't risk my own heart getting broken twice by the same man. Then don't, Alexander said, dropping to his knees beside the picnic table, not caring who might see the mighty Alexander Sterling begging in a small-town park. Don't risk anything. Let me prove myself first. Let me show you that I've changed, that I'm worth the risk. Elena opened her eyes and looked down at him. This powerful man humbled himself in the dirt for her forgiveness, and Alexander saw something flicker in her gaze. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe possibility. How? She asked. Alexander smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd managed in 6 months. However you let me, I'll stay in Tennessee as long as it takes. I'll help with the restaurant, with Isabella, with saving your family's farm. I'll prove that you and our daughter are more important to me than money or power or anything else in this world. Elena was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she would say no, that his chance had truly passed. Then Isabella made a soft cooing sound, and Elena looked down at their daughter with an expression of such love it took Alexander's breath away. One chance, she said finally, her voice still wrapped in silk. One chance to prove you're not going to run when things get hard. But Alexander, if you hurt us again, if you disappoint Isabella the way you disappointed me, I will make sure you never get another opportunity. Are we clear? Crystal, Alexander said, and for the first time in 6 months, he felt like he could breathe again. As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Alexander Sterling began the most important campaign of his life. Not for money or power or market dominance, but for love, forgiveness, and a family worth fighting for. 3 months. That's how long it took for Alexander Sterling to completely transform his life and prove to Elena Rodriguez that some men are worth the second chance they're begging for. He'd rented a small cottage on the outskirts of Millerville, trading his Manhattan penthouse for a place with creaking floorboards and a garden where he grew tomatoes with soil under his fingernails. Every morning at 5 a.m., he appeared at Elena's kitchen, rolling up his sleeves to help with prep work, learning the difference between dicing and mincing, between love and just cooking food. The townspeople had been suspicious at first. What did some fancy city billionaire want with their Elena? But Alexander won them over 1 cup of coffee at a time, one genuine conversation, one moment of authentic connection after another. He fixed Mrs. Patterson's ancient cash register without being asked, sponsored the high school baseball team's new uniforms, and somehow convinced the mayor to let him fund the renovation of the town's crumbling library. But it was the small moments that mattered most. The way he showed up every single day, reliable as sunrise. The way he learned to change Isabella's diapers without flinching, to warm bottles at 3 a.m. when Elena was exhausted from a busy restaurant day. The way he listened to Elena's dreams of expanding the restaurant, of maybe writing a cookbook someday, of giving Isabella everything she never had. Elena watched it all with guarded eyes, waiting for the moment he'd remember he was Alexander Sterling, tech mogul, and this small-town life would lose its novelty. But that moment never came. Instead, she watched him become someone she'd never seen before. Not the cold businessman or the charming seducer, but a man discovering what it meant to build something with his hands, to be part of community, to love without conditions or calculations. The night everything changed started like any other. Elena was closing the restaurant late, Isabella sleeping in her carrier, while Elena balanced the books at corner table. Alexander appeared in the doorway, keys in hand. He'd taken over the evening cleanup routine weeks ago, claiming it gave him time to think. Go home, he said softly, the same thing he said every night. I'll finish up here. But tonight, Elena didn't move. She looked up at him. This man who'd traveled across the country to grovel for forgiveness, who'd spent 3 months proving his worth one small act at a time, and felt something shift inside her chest. Alexander, she said quietly, and something in her tone made him freeze, made him look at her with sudden intensity. What is it? Elena stood slowly, leaving the account book scattered across the table, and moved toward him with a fluid grace that had first captured his attention in a Manhattan penthouse that felt like another lifetime. I've been thinking, she said, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, could smell the scent of him that had haunted her dreams for months. About second chances, about whether people can really change, about whether I'm brave enough to risk my heart again on a man who shattered it once before. Alexander went very still, hardly daring to breathe, as Elena reached up to touch his face. The first time she'd touched him since that night in Napa Valley, when the world was full of wine and possibility. And what did you decide? He whispered. Elena's smile was soft, tentative, but genuine. I decided that the man I fell in love with in California isn't the same man who betrayed me on television, and the man who's been making me coffee every morning for 3 months, who learned to braid Isabella's hair, who cried when she said data for the first time. She took a shaky breath. That man might be worth the risk. Alexander's hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent, disbelieving. Elena, I love you, she said simply, and the words hit him like lightning, like salvation, like everything he'd been praying for during 3 months of patient waiting. I never stopped loving you. I hated you. I tried to forget you, but I never stopped loving you. Alexander's kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he couldn't quite believe she was letting him back into her heart. But when Elena melted against him, when her arms came around his neck, and she kissed him back with all the longing she'd been suppressing for months, he deepened their connection with desperate gratitude. They kissed until they were both breathless, until years of hurt and months of careful distance dissolved into the simple truth that they belonged together, that love had been worth fighting for after all. Marry me, Alexander whispered against her lips, the proposal spilling out before he could second-guess himself. Elena pulled back to look at him, surprise and joy warring in her green eyes. Alexander, I know it's too soon, he rushed on. I know I don't deserve you, I know. Yes, Elena interrupted, her smile bright enough to power the entire town. Yes, Alexander repeated, hardly daring to believe it. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll take another chance on us. Yes, I'll trust you with my heart again. Her laugh was pure music. But you're buying the ring from Patterson's Jewelry downtown, not some fancy Manhattan store. And we're getting married in the church where I was baptized with the whole town watching. Alexander spun her around, both of them laughing like children, like people who've been given the most precious gift in the world, a second chance at forever. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning when the Tennessee hills were green with new life and possibility, Elena Rodriguez became Elena Sterling in a ceremony that will be talked about in Millerville for decades to come. She walked down the aisle of the small white church in her grandmother's lace dress, Alexander waiting for her at the altar in a simple black suit that made his gray eyes shine with tears of joy. Isabella, now walking and babbling in sentences only her parents understood, served as the world's most adorable flower girl, scattering rose petals with enthusiastic abandon. The whole town came. Farmers and shop owners, teachers and mechanics, all the people who watched Elena grow up and welcome Alexander into their community with cautious warmth that had gradually become genuine affection. Even Marcus flew in from New York, serving as Alexander's best man and weeping openly during the vows. Do you, Elena Marie Rodriguez, take Alexander James Sterling to be your lawfully wedded husband? Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and blessing. I do, Elena said, her voice strong and sure, her eyes never leaving Alexander's face. And do you, Alexander James Sterling, take Elena Marie Rodriguez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Alexander's voice was thick with emotion as he answered, I do. I absolutely do. The kiss that sealed their union was soft and sweet and full of promise. Not the desperate passion of newfound love, but the steady flame of a connection tested by hardship and emerged stronger. The congregation erupted in cheers. Isabella clapped her tiny hands. And somewhere in the back, Elena's mother wept happy tears in the tissues that Alexander had thoughtfully provided. The reception was held at Elena's kitchen. Transformed for the occasion with fairy lights and wildflowers, long tables groaning under the weight of home-cooked food and community love. Alexander's wedding gift to Elena was a deed to the restaurant building, purchased months earlier, but saved for this moment, ensuring that Elena's kitchen would belong to Elena forever, no matter what the future might bring. Elena's gift to Alexander was simpler but no less profound. A leather-bound photo album chronicling their journey from that first collision in his Manhattan penthouse to this moment, surrounded by family and friends and the promise of forever. The last page was blank except for a single inscription: "Our story is just beginning." They danced their first dance to an old country song about love found and lost and found again, Isabella sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms while her parents swayed together under stars that seemed brighter than usual, as if the universe itself was celebrating their second chance. Years passed like pages in a fairy tale. Elena's kitchen expanded into Elena's cafe and catering, with a cookbook deal and a small cooking show filmed right there in Millerville. Alexander's business evolved too. He kept Sterling Industries, but moved most operations to Nashville, building a tech hub that brought jobs and prosperity to rural Tennessee while keeping his family close to their roots. Isabella grew into a bright, curious child who was equally comfortable in boardrooms and barnyards, who spoke with slight southern drawl and had her father wrapped completely around her tiny finger. She was joined by twin boys when she was 3, James and Marcus, named for the grandfather Isabella would never meet and the friend who'd pushed their father toward redemption. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Alexander found Elena in their garden at dawn, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the hills that had become home to them both. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the old porch swing he'd installed their first year of marriage. Elena considered the question seriously, looking out over the life they'd built together. The thriving business, the children's laughter echoing from the house, the community that had embraced them both, the love that had survived scandal and separation and emerged stronger than ever. "Just one," she said finally. Alexander's heart clenched. "What?" Elena turned to smile at him, the same smile that had captured his heart in a Manhattan penthouse a lifetime ago. "I regret that it took us so long to find our way home to each other." Alexander pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, marveling at the miracle of ordinary moments made extraordinary by love. "Maybe we needed the journey to appreciate the destination." "Maybe," Elena agreed, settling against his shoulder as their children's voices began to drift from the house. Isabella reading a story to the twins, their family waking up to another day of possibility. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Tennessee sky in shades of gold and promise, Alexander Sterling held his wife in the quiet morning light and knew with absolute certainty that he was the luckiest man alive. Some love stories end with happily ever after, but the best ones, the truest ones, end with forever yours. And in the rolling hills of Tennessee, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of community, and the steady flame of love tested and proved true, Elena and Alexander Sterling lived there forever, one perfect day at a time.